Hello everyone, my name is Nikolai, and I'm actually quite new working with Kubernetes, but this is also why I built a project to make it easier for myself. So I'm going to talk about KSail today, a project I built to kind of make an SDK for Kubernetes so you can work with it easier when you're working with it locally. So a little bit about me first. So I'm a platform engineer at Energinet, and I'm also an open source facilitator where I try to help the organization become better at working with open source and contributing when we work with open source. And then I have a master's in software engineering in data mesh and data spaces, and I'm also an open source enthusiast in my private time. I use a lot of time on GitHub, and I like to become part in discussions and also contribute when I have the time. And then I am a Kubernetes nerd. So my problem when I started working with Kubernetes about 2 years ago, I think, it was actually pretty hard because there's this steep learning curve where you have to learn a lot of tools to even get started. And that was a problem for me because I thought, wow, okay, how do I even get a cluster running and stuff like that? So I thought that the developer experience is actually not that good, especially if you compare. And then I thought that it's annoying that this approach with Kubernetes is that you put everything in some running environment and then you test and do stuff there, instead of actually making this a thing where you can test if it works locally before you put it in a running environment. So I wanted to provide that, and luckily there are some tools available that made that a lot easier for me. So some of the problems that arise when I want to do that is that now I have to think about what works on my machine does not equal that it works in the cloud. So there's a new problem where you have to make sure that the local environment that you're building is actually close to what you're trying to build. Because if it isn't, it doesn't provide much value. Then you just have another environment to maintain. So I wanted to make sure that whatever I build is something that I can put in the cloud, and then it just works. And then the other problem is that I wanted to make sure the Kubernetes workflow is as close to the programming workflow that I learned and loved. So where you have an SDK most of the time. No, I'm just going to jump back to that in a bit. So just to sum it up, when you work with Kubernetes, you use a lot of your brain cells, and it either feels like super awesome, like you're just a god, or it feels like super frustrating. My mission is to try to lower this barrier, and I want to do this with KSail. And I want to do that by providing a better developer experience and some good practices. It's opinionated in some form because I choose some tools that provides this experience. But if we can accept that, it can actually become much easier because you don't have to make a lot of selections all the time. And then my aim is also to make local Kubernetes more fun and enjoyable, especially for newcomers to Kubernetes, so it's more easy to get onboarded with this. You shouldn't have to write 10 or 13 commands to get a Kubernetes cluster running. Maybe one is enough. And then I also want to keep up the trends. There's a lot of stuff happening with Kubernetes. Something like Cilium is becoming very popular. And you really want to run that locally as well. So I also want to provide those features. Some of those are coming, some of those are in this project already. So just to look at the developer experience, when we have Kubernetes, we have maybe kubectl, customized subs, GitOps, kubeconfirm, Docker, Cilium, all these tools that you have to learn and use to make something nice locally. And then when you program something, you typically just have an SDK and Docker, and then you're good to go. So there's a lot of upfront headache that you have to learn to work with when you're working with Kubernetes. And if we try to map this into how I typically build stuff, then we have this local development environment where we have maybe Minikube, K3D, Talos, and Docker, one of these local Kubernetes distributions that runs in Docker. And then we put some shell scripts around it, or maybe a makefile setup, and we use a lot of binaries to do something with this cluster. It could be installing GitOps, reconciling changes to it with GitOps, or maybe installing Cilium, and all these things that you might want to do. And this setup is something that you then put in a repo with the cluster, and then it's there, and then it's maintained with the cluster. But then you have to run it in CI/CD as well, and then you might have to add some stuff there, and it becomes more complex because it's this huge thing that is combined of a lot of files, and it's almost a project of its own. So I feel that we can do something there. So I thought about, let's clean that up and try to put a tool in there. So locally, I have KSail, which allows me to build K3D kind clusters and install GitOps and let me reconcile very easily. And I can also do this in CI/CD, so I can actually spin up a full cluster in CI/CD and see that it works before I apply it to a running environment. There are some problems with it because it doesn't scale horizontally, but I will talk about that in a bit. So what is KSail? So KSail is a single binary tool. So it's a binary that you can run some commands with, and then it will do some stuff. So some of the stuff that it can do is it can provision Docker and Docker clusters. So that would be K3D, kind, Talos, and Docker at some point. And when it does that, it can also provision some Docker resources like a registry. So in this case, in the way that I set it up is that it provisions a Docker registry to contain OCI artifacts. So when you want to push some manifest changes from your GitOps repo, you pack these in a OCI artifact, push them to this registry, and then you trigger the GitOps tool to pull these changes in. And then when the changes are pulled in, it will begin pulling down images from the public cloud. And by default, I provide mirror registries to ensure that these images actually land locally also before they are applied. And this is quite important when you're working with local Kubernetes, because one thing that you will notice is if, for example, if you have a K3D cluster, when you spin it down and spin it up again a few times, you will hit a rate limit, and then you're basically done for today. So that's a bit annoying. So if you have these mirror registries, you have an option to just continue working where you left off if you spin down the cluster or shut down the cluster. And then it's also a 100% declarative configuration that I provide with KSail. So KSail is on the left side here, where you can see if I write KSail help, I get some information about the commands. We can KSail up provisions a cluster in Docker, and then we can do KSail lint to check that the manifest files are actually as they should be. This command is also run when you run KSail up. Then you have KSail gen to generate Kubernetes resources. For example, if you need a secret, you don't have to create a YAML file, create the boilerplate code. You just write KSail gen yada yada secret, and then you get a secret. And then you have KSail debug, which basically just wraps K9s and runs that for you. So the idea is that you have this one tool that provides you the things that you need to work with Kubernetes. And then on the other side, you have these declarative configurations. Luckily, some of these Docker-based distributions already provide these. So Kind has one, and K3D has one. Talos also has one, but it's quite different. So that's why it's a bit harder to implement, because it's a whole YAML configuration that you can merge and stuff with. So you have to create some opinionated workflow around that, and I haven't had the time for that yet. But when you provide these files, and you run KSail up without any flags, it uses those files as the defaults. But then you can always override whatever settings you have set in the files to do something else. So out of the box, KSail provides some features, but here in this slide, I put in some of the considerations as well, because I hope that maybe you will give some feedback on what you want this tool to become. So first off, it supports Linux and macOS, and it should also support Windows. I haven't tested it. I don't have a Windows machine, and I cannot run CI. Din doesn't work in GitHub Actions Windows runners, so I cannot test it there either. So it works in Linux and macOS. And then for container engines, it works with Docker, and I'm considering Podman as well. And then it can spin up Kubernetes distributions of Kind and K3D. I have plans to do Talos and Docker. And then I'm considering also providing cluster API and vCluster as technologies to run the cluster. This is because when you do K3D, Kind, it only scales vertically. You only have the resources in the VM or PC that you're running the cluster in. So you cannot run your big enterprise clusters with KSail. But maybe if we provided a feature for cluster API, you had some metal laying around, and you can just spin up your development environment there and work on it and close it down after. So that would be an option also. For GitOps tooling, I only know Flux, so I decided on Flux, but I think it could also work with Argo CD. There are some differences I know about that I think it makes it a bit hard to find a generic way to do all the same stuff, but it could work. For CNIs, I use the defaults that are provided with the distributions, but I also want to provide the option of using Cilium, like without having to do anything, for all the distributions that are supported. For client-side validation, I do YAML syntax validation and schema validation today, and I also want to provide integrations with tools like Polaris. There's something called Kubescape and other tools that can scan your YAML files for best practices and security things that you might have done wrong. So that would also help a lot to ensure that whatever you wrote is actually good enough to get up in the cluster. For server-side validation, I'm considering it because it's a little bit weird in this project, I think, but it could work because you could maybe run a command to say KSail check, and then it does a pull out of the Kverno reports or something to see if you actually, if you adhere to those. It could also be something like Polaris that does live scans on your cluster, and then you can check if you have a good score. And for secret management, I wrote this slide a week ago, and I wanted to have this ready, but it's not ready. But I want to do subs plus H locally. So the idea is that you can use subs to encrypt the files in Git. So you can also manage, you can manage everything in Git without having to worry about using other tools. It doesn't lock you down in any way. It's still just GitOps, so you can just set up a vault, HashiCorp vault in the GitOps and make that work for you if you want. But I think that's not something the tools should support. So this is more if you need to encrypt a secret or a config map. You could use subs here. And then it has a lot of code generation capabilities. It can generate all the files that you would need to run a cluster. There was this init command, which actually generates a whole project structure for you. And it uses a lot of these code generation features. And it's template-based. So right now there's only one template. But if you have a good idea for some other way to structure your GitOps repo, let me know, because then we could also do a template for that. And then I want to try this thing with live demos, so that the God be with me. So I have a folder here where I want to create a cluster in. So to do that, I do KSail init, and it just uses. Okay. How does that work? Help. Let's try that. Worked it out. No, that's not good. Oh shit. Where did it go? There. Let's just do that first. And then mirror. Oh. Wrong one. Mirror, right? There we go. You see the same as me now. Cool. Sorry about that. So we have a folder here called KCD 2024, and we want to create a cluster together today. So to do that, we just want to use the defaults first off. So I do KSail init, and this generates a file structure that we can see here. So we have a K8s folder, and then we have some config files. In the K8s folder, we have a very simple configuration. We have the cluster KSail default, where we have this Flux system configuration in it. And then we have these customization flows in the root, which is for apps, infrastructure, and infrastructure controllers. And if we just want to see this in a more visual way, I have a diagram here. That's very blurry, but I hope you can see. So the idea is that the apps depend on the infrastructure, and those depend on the infrastructure controllers. And this is a very simple setup, but it provides you with enough control that you can actually have some operators installed in the infrastructure controllers, which create some custom resource definitions, and then you can use those in the infrastructure. If you don't have these dependencies between them, you wouldn't be able to use the custom resources because they don't exist when you try to create them with GitOps. So this way makes a minimal viable way to make custom resources work, basically. So now we have this cluster configuration laying around, but it doesn't run anything. So if we do KSail up now, we will see that it begin spinning up the cluster, creating these registries in Docker, Can I zoom a bit? And yeah, it's going to provision with kind by default. And it also did a validation of the files first. This takes a little while, so while it does that, let's just try and debug it over here. And I have to write kubeconfig because that's a bug. But normally you wouldn't have to do that. So we can see here that it's doing stuff. Yes. That's good. Oh. Wow. And I actually want to check out the customizations here, but it's a bit slow. So that's what happens with live demos, I guess. Let's see. It hadn't installed Flux yet, so it takes a little time. But yeah, we can see that it bootstraps GitOps with Flux. It does the installation of the Flux resources, and then it begins reconciling the customizations that we have in the cluster, or in the cluster configuration. So in here, we should be able to go to customizations now. I don't know why that happens. Okay, well, we would be able to check how far it was. I think it's slow to see the changes, but we can also follow it here. It's basically reconciling Flux system now, and then reconcile infrastructure controllers, infrastructure, and then apps. So when it's done with that, I want to try to add some apps. Let's see. This takes a little while. Can I say something else? Let's see. Oh. It's done now. So what I wanted to do now is actually add some apps. And the easiest way to do that for me is just do init again, and then we do Helm releases, which is a shortcut to add some base Helm releases. So we get a pod info, cert manager, and traffic. So if we do that, it will generate some more files, but it will skip the files that already exist. This means that some of the customizations do not have the added stuff to them. So if we do code here, we can just add that. Yes. So here we need to add cert manager certificates. And cluster issuers. And in here we need to add pod info. And in here we need to add traffic and cert manager. And then we can do KSail update. And then we'll validate the files again to check if I did something I shouldn't. I didn't. And now it pushes these files to an OCI artifact, which is picked up by GitOps immediately. So now it's reconciling this. This also takes a little time. We can probably check it now. No, something is wrong there. Sorry about that. But we can see that it's installing Cert Manager right now. So yeah, that is most of what it can do, actually. And we also, I can show one more thing. So if we go into KDS and say that we have this pod info app and we want to generate a secret, we can do KSail gen. Let's see, KSail gen, and then native here for native resources. I tried to follow some structure that Kubernetes was using upstream. I'm not sure if I like it, but in here there's a secret. When we do that, it generates a secret.yaml. So we can then go in and find that secret here, and we could add that to the release as well if we wanted. And these secrets are just some templates, and then we have to fill in the information. But it's still quicker than having to write the boilerplate yourself, especially if you have larger files than secrets, right? And yeah. I think we'll move on to the Q&A. See if we can Why this emoji stuff? There we go. There we go. Thank you. So that is KSail. There's a lot of hidden gems in there as well, but I don't want to demo too much. It takes too much time. So, yeah. Any questions? Yes, up there.
Thank you.
Hello.
Was too loud. All right, I was just thinking, could you give an example of how you use it in your CI/CD processes?
Yes. I just moved, so my cluster's down, so it doesn't work, but I can show some stuff anyhow. But I have a Homelab at home. Where I use KSail. It's built with KSail, basically. It's an earlier version, but in here I'll also have a KDS folder with all the stuff that I need. And then I have this pipeline here called test. And here we can see, if we go down a little, zoom in. There we go. First I install KSail. And then I provision the cluster with KSail. In this case, it also uses some subs functionality that worked in the previous version, but doesn't work right now. And then it runs KSail up to run the cluster. And this basically runs the full cluster on a GitHub Actions node that I'm running in my own server metal. And then it tests that the reconciliation works. If it works, it moves on, and then I can merge the PR and throw it over to my ESA tool, infrastructure as code. So that's how I use it. Very simple. Just KSail up. But you could say it doesn't test much. It just tests the reconciliation flow works. But further down the line, if I add more server-side validation and stuff like that to KSail, we could do even more here. The thing is, however, as it is today, you have to have large enough runners to run this. So that is one thing that has to be considered. Just to find some workflow. There we go. So it takes about 11 minutes for it to do it. But this is what happens, basically. It runs it up in CI and tests everything works.
I think we have a couple of other questions here.
Yes?
Yeah, thanks. Great tool. I would have loved this when I used Flux. Could you talk about how you would use this to do like app development in a cluster? How would it hook up to the OCI registry in the cluster? If, for instance, I'm to develop a Go app and want to deploy it in Kubernetes, how would that work in KSail?
Oh, yeah, okay. I think it's meant for platform engineers. So I think it's not for app developers so much. Yeah.
Hi, Christian Klein from Elasticity here. Tell me if you agree with the following or not. KSail saves you time doing, but doesn't save you time learning.
Somewhat, yes, because there's a lot of complexity around the tooling that you use that you have to understand. But it saves you time if you know this tooling, because then you don't have to write all the make files and shell files to make it work. So yes, there's still a lot of complexity around Kubernetes that I don't solve with KSail. Yeah.
So you do, like, you create your old cluster, and I saw you have cert manager and traffic floating around. Do you support ingress via something like Magic DNS, something like NIP?
No, I am considering it because I really want to be able to run a cluster and you have an ingress working out by default. But right now I have to fiddle with the host files to make that work.
Okay. Have you? But are you familiar with NIP?
No, I think I've heard about it, but no.
Okay. It's just a Magic DNS. So you put an IP in front, so you only need to discover the IP automatically from your local machine, and then it resolves. It's a wildcard DNS to that IP.
Okay,
so you can use host names.
So it works on the local machine with just one. Okay, nice. Yeah, I need to use that. Thanks. It's awesome. Yep.
Other questions?
Oh, thank you. Maybe not a question, but suggestion. But in customized CLI, there is an option to add resources to customization files out of the box. So perhaps it will be convenient if it finds customized file, add it secret automatically to customized file.
With the initialization.
No, when you create a secret, for example.
Oh yeah,
You
yeah.
have
That
to
could
go
work.
manually add resources, but instead you can just use customize to add resource to it.
Yeah, that could work. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think
I like being on stage right now.
get my exercise.
Amazing tool. I wanted to ask if you see the future of the tool more as a tool that you use in CI/CD, so by machines, or do you think, or do you focus more on what platform engineers need to do themselves and to manage their own clusters?
Platform engineers. I think the part where you can use it in CI/CD is more by coincidence, but it works. But I think I'm going to focus more on making it easier for like platform engineers to build their projects. And also this thing about moving, having this moving SDK that you could take to another cluster and kind of expect it to work. But there's a lot of, like, there's some opinionated stuff here, and it is hard to, I don't know what clusters people are building, and I don't know if this would work at all, but hopefully we can build something together that works.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Did you Google for the term KSail before you decided the name of your project? And are you associated with some sailing community or something?
It's actually, I don't write PHP or Laravel, but there's this thing called something sail. Yeah, that's where I got it from. But yeah, it's by coincidence. I thought it sounded fun because Kubernetes SDK, and then you have Docker and the ship and everything. So this makes sense. This makes sense. Let's go with that. Yeah. So.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hello again.
Hello.
I was just wondering if you're actively using it in Energinet, in your platform team.
I did, but in the new team we are moving very fast, so I haven't had the time to catch up. But I'm going to use it at some point, I hope. Yeah. But there are other peoples in Energinet that are using it, and I think some of them are here today. So, yeah.
All right. Sounds like a wrap. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please give a round of applause.